Feast or famine. Last time we had over 30 people. This week we have a smaller turnout. But it's still an exciting story. Let me just start with a word of prayer. Oh Lord, fill us with your joy and peace this day. May our minds be open to the words of your scripture. May we be filled with the power of your holiness. Amen. Amen. The story so far. We've had Exodus 1, where we focused on the midwives, when you're allowed to lie. Last session, we talked about when you're allowed to kill, where Moses killed the Egyptian taskmaster. And this week, we're not as exciting. We're going to talk about the burning bush. We're going to talk about, is God real? Now, if you were a little boy, I know some of us weren't little boys, but when you were a little boy, did you ever go through a period of what you wanted to be when you grow up? Jeremy, what did you want to do?
I wanted to be a professional soccer player.
Professional soccer player. Gail, what about yourself?
Pilot.
Pilot? Me? I wanted to be Telly Savalas in the movie On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I wanted to live on a mountaintop in Switzerland with all these women and all these gadgets and all this power. I wanted to live the life of a master criminal. Because, you know, if God wasn't real, and all there is what I can touch, feel, eat, and smell, let's go for it. Let's go for it all. And the best possible way to be, I didn't want to be bald, but apart from that, being a master criminal on a mountaintop in Switzerland in a James Bond movie was a way to go through life. If God wasn't real, what does morality matter? What does it matter what other people think? What does it matter? If it's just me and the world, if it's just atoms and molecules, why not just go for it all? Well, for me the problem was I also believed in Jesus Christ and I couldn't really do both. So I couldn't be a master criminal on the top of a mountain. And one of the things we're going to focus on this week is the argument, is God real? And does it really matter? What does it matter? Can we say that God is real? What can we say about that? What can we understand that? In other words, we're not going to try to prove things mathematically or scientifically, but why should we believe in a living God? Well, let's start with Exodus 3. Now, Exodus 2 concludes with Moses moving into the wilderness, marrying Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, and he is taken over the family business of being a shepherd. Now, verse 1, now Moses, tending the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness. Well, why did he do that? Well, it's probably because of overgrazing. He wanted to keep going to the fresh grass, and there were those other shepherds, the Midianites, whom they were having problems at the well with. So the overgrazing around the well drove Moses to go to farther fields. But Winston Churchill, yes, we're quoting Winston Churchill in the study of the Bible, had this to say about prophets in wilderness. Every prophet has to come from civilization, but every prophet has to go into the wilderness. He must have a strong impression of a complex society and all that it is to give, that he must serve periods of isolation and meditation. This is the process by which psychic dynamite is made. Now, what's Churchill mean by that? I think that's a very profound statement. You can't walk into a society if you're a complete stranger and change it. You have to know how it works. You have to have experienced it. You can't walk into Manhattan and say, okay, I'm going to change the big city and I'm going to change Wall Street, I'm going to change the world, if you're just off the farm from Tennessee. You've got to experience it. You have to know how it works. You have to understand what the people think, how the world works. But at the same time, if all your life you've spent in Manhattan and you've never been in that period of isolation and testing, you're not going to have, if you will, that psychic dynamite, that inner strength. I look at my own life, for instance. I have been in wilderness times where it looked to me like, Lord, why have you sent me to Okeechobee? So, no, I seriously would say this to myself. Lord, I am a sophisticated person. I grew up in big cities. I mean, I know the world. I even worked on Wall Street for a year or two. And yet you're having me minister to people, to cowboys. And there's nobody like me. And it's just me and Susan and God in Okeechobee. And a lot of cows. Now, I'm being melodramatic, of course, but I think it's important that each of us at a certain time go through a wilderness period of knowing that isolation, so that when we step up into the world, we know how important it is. Now, my having served in Okeechobee means I will never ever take this parish for granted. I know that sounds silly, but I have been in places I'd rather not go back to. It was a nice place, there were nice people, it was faithful, but I know what I know what God has given me here. Do you understand that? Whereas I've known people who their entire life they sort of progressed through megachurch to megachurch to megachurch, and they've never actually had to do anything other than to show up from Monday through Friday, and then on Sunday mornings. So I think Churchill's very right. What do you think about that? That each of us need to go through a wilderness period before we're really ready to change the world. Kathy, you're shaking your head. Do you agree or disagree?
Yes, my wilderness period was just the past 2 years, actually. When I came home from Honduras, I didn't have a purpose. And I was saying to God, too, why did you bring me back? I was perfectly happy in Honduras. Why did you make me come back to Honduras? And that was settled when you and I started talking about Stephen Ministry, and suddenly I have a purpose again.
And you value Stephen's ministry because you know it's of God.
Absolutely.
You know it's of God in your life right now.
Absolutely.
It's not just a job. It's not just the latest assignment. It's the task that God has laid upon your heart to bring to this community.
Absolutely.
My coming to this church, I know I really upset Kathy Allen, who was the head of the search committee, when I told her I never read the parish profile. I gave it to Susan to read. Because what I did is that if this is of God, I will trust God. I will pray and I will be open to God's invitation, but I'm not going to work to make myself look good to, what they're looking for. I'm going to be who I am. I'll let Susan read the stuff. But if this is of God, it'll work out. And what happened? I believe it was of God. God called me to be here. So let's continue. And he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now we don't know exactly what Horeb is. It probably is another word for Mount Sinai. In Book of Kings, Elijah journeys to the mountain of God at Horeb. And so we're really not quite certain, but it's probably Sinai or that area. And an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed. Now, the Jewish scholar Nahum Sarna notes that in the ensuing dialogues between God and Moses, it is God, not an angel, who speaks. But the angel is necessary because God cannot appear in the bush. This would be too jolting for Moses. This is, early Christians like to think it was Jesus who appeared in the bush. Later Christians said, no, that's not so. Now, why would we do that? Because the Bible identifies this as an angel of the Lord. And one of the things that the Bible is quite clear is that Jesus is not an angel. He's a real man. He's the Son of God. And though it may seem pious to say, oh, it's Jesus talking for Dad, no, we can't shove him in there. Though it's tempting to do that whenever sort of God has human interaction. In the Old Testament, those are angels. We really don't want to say that that's Jesus, because Jesus is quite clear. I am not an angel. I am a man. I am also the Son of God. So an angel of the Lord is speaking to Moses. And it's the angel, if you will, is the megaphone. It's the vehicle through which God communicates to Moses. Now, one of the things that Jewish commentators like to say is that, well, why? It's the same story. Why was Jesus born in Okeechobee, in Bethlehem? Why did God speak from a burning bush, not from a magnificent cedar tree? Why wasn't Jesus born in the palace of Jerusalem? And one of the things the Jewish rabbis said is that because God is everywhere, God's presence is not made better by being in a shinier building. God's presence is just as powerful in a lowly old scrubby bush or in a magnificent tree. Now in the movie, it's fascinating to see that a California sagebrush sprung up in the mountain in Sinai. It was caught on fire. So don't think that's what it looked like. The bushes, the brush is not, I'm sorry, it was California, in the movie with Charlton Heston, it's a eucalyptus, California eucalyptus tree, which is sort of pretty, a little dusty, but you know, but this is a thorny, scrubby, this is like the junk we see on the side of the highway. It's not a particularly pleasant plant, yet this is on fire. And the bush was all aflame, but it was not consumed. And this image becomes the most famous metaphor for the Jewish people. Like the bush that burns but is not destroyed, the Jewish people too have been burned but never destroyed. A divine fire sustains the Jews. In 1948, one of the things that the Jewish people, when they returned to Palestine from Europe, said was that we have survived, you know, the Holocaust. The burning bush was a potent symbol following the Holocaust. Why was that? Because the Jewish people were burned, destroyed, yet they still survived, even though that. Now Moses said, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't this bush burn up? And one can assume just about anyone who looks at a burning bush would go, oh wow, neat. It's like me driving past a wreck on the highway. Oh, you know, it'll keep me, I'll slow down and I'll back up traffic like everybody else, but it'll keep me occupied for about five seconds, and then I move on. But Moses stopped and stared. Now, if you saw a traffic wreck, unless you're my wife Susan, who would stand and stare for hours, wouldn't you just usually move on and not really think twice about it? Oh, isn't that interesting, but move on. Moses stops. Why is this not burning? And Moses began to dawn on him that the miraculous was at work here. And it sort of raises the question that our author, Prager, goes into in some detail. And that it's a choice that we all have when we're looking at life. When do I see a miracle? When do I see a miracle? Are there miracles around me that I'm not picking up? Am I seeing stuff? Am I taking the time to look and to see? Now, there's stuff that we can sort of romantically say, oh, brand new baby, that's a miracle, yes. Or, oh, I will look into an art museum, oh, that's a miraculous thing, you know. But what is do we see God around us? Do you ever sort of, how does that sort of strike you? Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote a poem in the Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. Susan and Laura and Claudia spent last summer in Hawaii. And one of the things that Susan is good at, she's good at reflecting. And one of the things that she got time and time again, she would get up early as the dawn would rise and walk on the beaches in Hawaii and just was struck just by the miracle of God's creation, how beautiful this place was. I mean, yes, we like Lecanto, but Diamond Head is beautiful. Hawaii is beautiful. And just a sense, have you ever experienced that in nature? Have you ever been hiking or been to the Grand Canyon or been to something that is just so spectacular that you just got to stop and look at it? People shaking their head because, yeah, get on with it, or yes, you agree.
Yes, I agree.
And Domenica, do you have something that strikes you? Or?
Well, I lived in Chicago, so what did I know? I just knew the streets of Chicago. But when I went to Colorado, we were going up the mountain. The awesomeness of God's creation just overwhelmed me. The beauty, the serenity, and yet the majestic mountains, it just was overwhelming.
Well, I can remember, now this sounds like a boy speaking, when I first saw the World Trade Center. Just standing at the concourse underneath and looking up. And, you know, just there's this feeling in my stomach of just, you know, magnificence and awe. But I think where the author is going with this is that life is made up of choices. We can choose to stop and look and experience God, or we can keep moving. Does anybody have a sense of that in their own life, that they sometimes get so busy that they just miss God around them because they're too busy going to the next project, going to the next game?
I can identify well with that. I have a piece of property in Lake City that has a borrow pit. For anybody who knows what a borrow pit is, when they widened the road, they dug out the dirt and all. And over the years, it's developed into a spring-fed little lake. But you never think about it. It's a borrow pit. It's been there many years. And just before I decided to move to the diaconate, I was over there one morning, early in the morning, and that is probably one of the prettiest looking lakes. I mean, it's gorgeous. But all these years, it's just been, but I never stopped to look at it because I didn't have time to appreciate it. That was property and, you know, pretty much kind of thing. But to stop and think and look, like you say, it's a whole nother avenue. It just opens up so much. And had I not made that decision, I probably would not have looked at it even then. But I had to stop and think. Fortunately.
You know, I'll ask a question to the men in this room who are married. But have you ever stopped and looked at your wife and just paused a second and think, damn, I'm a lucky guy? No, seriously.
All the time.
All the time. I know people
Good
are getting...
answer, Jeremy.
Seriously, I mean, how often do we take our wives or our husbands for granted? How often do we just assume that, well, you know, this is what I'm stuck with, might as well make the best of it, when the reality is, God has paired you with someone who is the best possible person for you right now.
Right on.
And do we really sometimes take the time to stop and say, man, this is a beautiful woman I'm married to. Man, this is a wonderful woman I'm married to. But we have to choose to do that. Because the default in this life is just to keep, you know, puttering on, just assuming, you know, this or that.
I think women
Yes,
can
Joy.
say that about their husbands too.
Well, I'll openly admit right now, my parents have been living with us for 3 full weeks, and it's difficult. I love my parents to death, but my husband has been so gracious to them, and I hope I've been telling him that enough over these past 3 weeks. And they're going to be with us 1 more week. So it is true. It's easy to cater to a 90-year-old and an 88-year-old and forget the one whose house really owns it. But you have to step back and really realize that even by him going into his office and hiding, he's really not hiding, but
Have you
doing-
taken up jogging?
I have to consciously remember and recognize the sacrifice that he's making during these weeks. And it's remarkable. It's given me a whole new renewal of the man that I married.
But you have to make, that's wonderful. And you always steal my thunder, you know that, Joe. I really should hand you this, but it comes back to you've made a choice. You've made a choice because I don't live with my parents, but I live close enough that I feel like I do. When I came home from the hospital, my mother called and said, the toilet's been running all week. Could you come fix it? And the VCR clock's flashing. And so those are minor things, but you have to choose to see the good sometimes in this life. Because we just become accustomed to things. So Moses starts a journey that leads him to be leading the people out of Egypt by stopping and looking and observing and doing more than just his routine. And now that applies to Moses, that applies to our lives as husbands and wives, parents and children, residents of this beautiful area. Just all the gifts that we've been given. We've got to stop sometimes, what's the phrase, and smell the roses. Otherwise, no one's going to do it for us.
Do you think that's the reason for the spending time in the wilderness is the opportunity to get away from the day-to-day work situation, life situation, and give yourself a chance to reflect on God and creation, beauty?
I think so. Doesn't necessarily have to be the wilderness. I did it from a hospital bed. In the sense I couldn't find my glasses, so I didn't watch TV, and I couldn't concentrate enough to read. So I just all I had to do was to think. And you know, if I didn't consciously direct my thoughts, they would go into areas I really wouldn't want to talk about publicly, you know, because the heart has its shameful corners, but when I concentrated on, you know, what I believe, what is God, what is important, I've got, the church tells me I've got 12 years left before I'm kicked out. We're into retirement. What do I want to accomplish? What do I want to do? What is important to me? Am I here to tend a machine, or am I here to win souls for Christ? In other words, exactly, you know, stop and just step to one side and say, you know, where am I in my life right now? One of the things, is it now time for me to stop worrying about my children? And the answer really was that yes, not completely, but they've finished school, they've started their first real job. I can't believe how much they get paid, but good, not bad. I mean, I remember my first job, I made $18,000 a year, and I thought I had it, and I was making a fortune. But I digress. But you know, you stop and just take account of yourself. And so that when you go back into the world, back into battle, back into the things, you know it's important, and you know it's not important.
Well, you also have to take into consideration the people who are alone, because then they have to actually step out of that safe cocoon and appreciate all that God's given them. Sometimes that's the tough one too, to step out, because it's scary out there. It's a big world.
Well, I want to push you on that. I am
I'm
very
getting
conscious of being I am very conscious of being fortunate of having a wife whom I can talk to probably about 90% of the things in my heart. The other 10% I'm a little too embarrassed and wouldn't want to say in public to anybody. But you know, I can say to her, Susan, have I really screwed up? Should I go back to law school? You know, stuff like that. I have a confidant. How does a person who's single deal with that? Do you deal with friends, or how do you know where I'm trying to go with that? What is the rock upon which you can bounce the ball against to see where things are?
Prayer and the kitty puss. Poor old kitty puss.
It's a good thing
Well,
pets can't talk back.
I think there's different people in our lives too. Like there are certain things that I would turn definitely to Jeremy and have him write my compass. And because I know he will tell me, no, Joanne, you're off base there. And then there's other things that I need to talk to my girlfriends about. And they're just going to empathize. I don't need them to say, you're wrong or whatever. So I think there's different people that I find that I turn to for different purposes. Not because they'll tell me what I want to hear, but because the severity of maybe what I want to talk about. I cannot bother Jeremy with the minutia. He just won't tolerate it. So I know don't do that. So I go to my girlfriends for that.
I have a very close male friend who lives up in Connecticut. I've known him for years and years. And I can talk to him about some stuff. He's also a Christian. So, I mean, we're on the same wavelength. He's a layman. He's got a computer company. And He's 5'4" and I'm 6'3", so we sort of look funny when we go out together. But there are things I can talk to him that I really wouldn't choose to talk to Susan about. Not that I couldn't talk to her about, but just because he has a perspective and a worldview. He's married, he has children, he has his own business, he is my age. In other words, I'm able to say to him things and ask him questions and not feel embarrassed.
I agree.
Does anybody, does that resonate with people? I mean, do you they tell me as a priest I should have another priest who's my confessor. Guess what? Never occurred to me. I don't like priests. No, but but they tell me I should, but I've never had another minister be, but I've always had lay male friends to do that. And certainly it's never been the bishop, but.
But that's one of the things they tell you in studies, to find an equal or above. I think Kathy will back me up on that, that you, whenever you talk to somebody, you need a priest or deacon or someone. That's what I was told.
My spiritual advisor has been my daughter since she was 2 years old.
Wow.
Never
Very
had any
good.
other.
Amen to that. My daughter is my rock.
Michelle just has an innate sense of God's goodness and worth, and she keeps me grounded.
Isn't it fascinating the variety that we're hearing in this room? Spouses, children, friends, girlfriend. I mean, there's no fixed. Everybody has their own. You know what I'm trying to say with this? There's no one right way to do it. But I think we all can come to sort of a consensus that it is something that we should try to do. Because I know one of the most destructive things I see in my ministry working here is loneliness. Of people, it's so sad, some of our older parishioners, their spouses are dead, their friends are dead.
They have no joy.
They basically, they may not have children, and they basically just have their cat or their dog. I'm not being silly, but that network that they once had is gone.
That's one reason I see the pet service as being so important. Because you're actually accepting that these are their children, if you will, and that's the family. And a lot of people will poo-poo that. Oh, come on, it's just a dog, it's just a cat. But it's very, very important. I think that's something that we've seen over the years with positive prayers, to see people come in, really don't have anybody else. They have that animal, and that animal means the world for them.
Just so people who may not be familiar, we don't worship the dogs.
Right.
In other words, we're not praying for the dog. I mean, we may pray for if a dog is sick or whatever, but the dogs and the cats are there as sort of an adjunct, almost like a security blanket for people, and we pray for the people, and their emotional security is in this little dog and this little cat. I think so. Because I know how close I am to our animals, and I know how important they are to my life. I don't want to go, getting back into our text, there's a long discursus on whether or not God exists. To be perfectly frank, I'm totally uninterested in that issue. It doesn't, it's, I mean, it's not something that I find particularly interesting, because to me it's so, God exists as much as this table exists for me. So if you're interested in that particular debate, I encourage you to read through this, but I really don't want to do that, because I don't think I'd be fair to the author, because I don't really care. Not that I don't dislike it, but it's just, yeah. But there's other things I want to get into deeper into this. Now, when the Lord, so let's skip the page, the 3.4. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God waits to call out Moses until Moses first notices God. For every human being, Abraham was a rare exception. That's how the divine human encounter takes place. God communicates with us after, or if we make the effort to notice his presence again. In other words, if you're walking along, except if your name is Abraham and you're starting off the game, God is not going to bop you on the head and surprise you. You've got to be seeking him. You've got to stop and look at the burning bush. You've got to stop and look at your life. You've got to basically ask the questions. God is not going to tackle you. God's going to let you do what you want to do. And if you don't want him, he's going to let you go down that path. So it may not be fair, but some people say, Lord, give me a sign if you're real. Well, he's not going to do that. He wants you to turn to him first, and then he's going to start.
But can't you say, God, open my eyes to see?
Yes, but see, you're asking the question to do it, which is different from saying, okay, prove it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll believe it once God does something to make me really believe.
Well, and it's just like with the burning bush, it was already burning, but know how many people walked by it and didn't notice. But Moses stopped, and when he stopped, it was God's chance to talk to him, God to man. And I think in my life, the same thing happens. You get busy and you're doing, and all of a sudden, you see something, like we said earlier, out of the ordinary. And you stop and you think about it, and that's when God can step in and join the conversation.
Two little analogies. I agree with you completely, Kathy. This is a hard class because we're all on the same page. Two little analogies. The author makes the point of, I think we all had to study Shakespeare in high school. And the first time you read it, it makes no sense whatsoever. But by the end of the semester, you're really into it because you've taken the effort to sort of learn the language, and then it grows on you. It's the same way with God. If you don't take the effort, it's not going to grow on you. Yesterday, I went to the walkathon at the Key Center. Stephanie Hopper's two sons, Matthew and Michael, have a little team, and I didn't walk. I actually sat under the pavilion with my I got a t-shirt, but I didn't walk. But I sat with some of the other people who I know from our services there. And what I've discovered is I speak dementia, or I speak disability. In other words, these people are no longer rather frightening, rather different, sometimes physically disgusting. All of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but after about 2 years, I understand them completely. And in them, I see God at work in their lives. That first Sunday when I did it with Aaron, it was actually pretty scary to me. Because, people with smells and fluids and jerks and strange language and this and that. But once I learned how to understand them and how to be with them, you know where I'm going with them? That God is, I made the effort, but isn't everything like that? I tell my children, I pursued your mother for 6 months before she'd give me a date. And the poor girl, she was a freshman. I told my friends no one was allowed to date her. But I was on the sports team, and I was in ROTC, and I was in a fraternity, so I sort of all 3 social bases covered. And so poor Susan had a really holy roommate who had a date every Saturday night, not Susan. Because no one was allowed to date her, and because I was too shy to ask her, but I still worked on it. But it took me 6 months. Everything worthwhile in this life takes effort. And that especially includes our relationship with God. 3:4 continued. God called out to him in the bush, Moses, Moses. He answered, here I am. God's call is to Moses an echo of God's call to Abraham. And he said, do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place in which you stand is holy ground. I still think of the Charlton Heston movie at this point. It was such a wonderful film when you were a little boy. Now, of course, this random spot in some wilderness is not inherently holy. In other words, there's not some secret spot in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula that, is special. But rather, it's because God appears there. Any place or situation in which we bring God or where we encounter God becomes holy. When we talk about in the marriage ceremony, we talk about the bridal bed and all this and that and the other in the Old Press book. That's a holy place, believe it or not. Because when you're married, it's a union of 2 people in God's glory and God's eyes, and that becomes a holy place. So the Taj Mahal suite in Las Vegas can be God's holy presence as well as the stays in Okeechobee. It's a problem. Nothing is intrinsically holy. It's too is a matter of choice. In other words, there's not, this is more of a Protestant world point of view, but there's nothing that by itself, the holy chair of Our Lady of Knock or whatever. We don't do this. It may have been holy, and oh, isn't that neat that this one's happened? But holiness is not tied to a thing, it's tied to God and our relationship.
That's the reason we don't have to have a church built.
Yeah, we don't necessarily, we should, it's nice.
It's nice if we do.
We do, but the church is not the building. The church is that gathering of people. The church is not the bishop or the
Don't tell
institution.
them
He makes the big bucks that you tell about. It's that place where this gathered people are there, and by their gathering, they make that holy spot. Now, again, this is a Protestant worldview. So if you come out of a Catholic tradition, they may say, this is not quite right. Yes.
I just, I'm reading a book right now, and this is just paralleling what you're saying. This is the 1500s in Kingsbridge, and the Protestants and the Catholics worshipped all sorts of dead monasteries, lots of materialistic holy things in the church, and the Protestants came in and destroyed it. And this is the Protestant view again. So it's just a fantastic read.
So there was a difficult period I know English church history better because it comes out of our heritage, but during the Reformation, Oliver Cromwell and the Protestant reformers, after they defeated the Royalists, they would run around and smashed the stained glass windows, they smashed the idols. The chapel, I went to a college in Oxford, Merton College, and it's a very big, tall building, and the stained glass windows that were sort of just like within arm's reach were all smashed, but Cromwell's troops couldn't reach the ones up top, so they survived. And they did it because they wanted to make the point that these things weren't, I think they were a little extreme in trying to make their point, but they wanted to make the point that in of itself, the stained glass window of this Virgin Mary, you shouldn't worship, therefore we get rid of it. That's overkill in my mind, but that was then, this is now, but yes, that 500, 600 years ago, this sort of stuff was really powerful. There were martyrs in England, Catholic martyrs in England who died rather than see these things destroyed. And then there were Protestant martyrs who died for destroying these things when the Catholics came. I mean,
Father, if it were today, it'd be different, but with the social media and with the instant on news and all the rest of it, how do you think it would be handled to, let's say, destroy an idol or to bring someone around? Would it be just total propaganda, or would it be the physical destruction as well?
well, let me put this, a real concrete example in Episcopal terms. And it gets into our church politics, so
Oops.
I'm not going to have it. There have been lawsuits. Some churches and dioceses have tried to quit the Episcopal Church over the gay issue. And there's another denomination of ex-Episcopalians called the Anglican Church in North America. Whole dioceses, like South Carolina, have left. And the National Church in New York has hired lawyers, and they have lawsuits to keep the buildings. In our diocese, we had the church up in Ocala, Grace Church, the church in Vero Beach, a church in Melbourne, and a church in Winter Springs, which is a suburb of Orlando. All say they wanted to leave. I was on the board in Central Florida at the time. I said that if these people want to go and take the buildings, let them take the buildings. Because we are basically making these buildings idols. That we're saying that, you know, if somebody says to you, give me your coat, take it off and give it to them. The people who are worshiping these buildings want to leave, and they're paying the rent and they're keeping them up. It's terrible, I don't want them to leave, but I believe that we're making an idol of the property. Bishop Howe, in his wisdom, came to an agreeing accommodation. He went to each of these churches. The one in Grace Church in Ocala was about a 55-45, 55 wanting to leave, and Bishop Howe said, no, I'm sorry. You can take the cash in the bank, but we're keeping the building so that the 45 have the building. The church in Winter Springs was 99-1. Bishop Howe said, goodbye and God bless you. And so he basically went in and looked and basically tried to divide the baby up. So in Vero Beach and Ocala, it was a very narrow margin, and he said to the congregations, we'll allow for those who wish to remain, you keep the building. Those who are leaving, you can keep the cash in the bank to start over again. For those that were completely that way, who wanted to go, he let them go. This church, the rector wanted to leave. And this was a mission, and it didn't have any money, and it was divided, and Deacon Joan didn't want to go, and the majority of people didn't want to go. And Bishop Howe said to the guy, bye-bye. You go start your own storefront church elsewhere. In South Carolina, there are people whose families have been buried in this churchyard for 400 years. And the thought that another group would take it over is so awful to them that they're spending tens of millions of dollars on lawsuits. I'm not going to say this to their face because it's so hurtful, but I think you're making a building into an idol. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
I think for your own spiritual health, now this is George's opinion, this is not gospel, but I think when you make these buildings an idol, you lose fact of what you lose, you know, it's, yeah, how do you think the Catholics felt in England when all of a sudden, oh, sorry, they're all ours now, you can't have them back. You know, the Catholics had to start all over in England because the Church of England kept everything. Do you think, is that a, what do you think about that? Mary, you've been involved, you all came from South Carolina. What do you think about this idolatry thing?
I think that it has probably been the most single destructive thing to the entirety. I've worked very closely in reconciliation, reconciliatory acts towards both groups of people, because these are good people that love the Lord and love each other and continue to love each other across the line. But they can't stop looking at the things, the buildings and the things, and start looking at the Lord for direction on both sides. They're so angry, and anger drives away our ability to truly be in communion with our God. So it's been, in my opinion, the enemy's tool to bring down a lot of good Christians.
The most egregious example of the hatefulness that's going on nationally is there was a church in Binghamton, New York. And Binghamton is not a thriving town. It's a dying New York, upstate New York mill town. The Episcopal Church wanted to leave. And the bishop in Syracuse said, no, you can't. And the congregation said, well, we've been saving our money and we'll buy the building from you. We'll pay you to go away. And this is, excuse me, sort of a crappy mill town, you know, not a particularly nice church. The bishop refused. He wouldn't even sell it to them. So the congregation moved out, and the bishop sold it for half the offering price to a Muslim group. Now, talk about a PR fiasco. Now, the breakaway group actually turned out better because they bought an old Catholic church for less that was bigger and better. They took all the statues down, but still. But that is that's how nasty it's gotten in some cases where I would rather see Muslims in this building than have you people stay. And that's
That's, oh, that's
not
sad.
Christian, that's sin. And that's the idolatry. So coming back to the beginning of the question of modern day idolatry, there's some things that are worth fighting for, and there are other things that I don't think are worth. I'm not going to die in a ditch over a building.
Pick your battle.
I'm not, and it's more important for me, it's the people that make up the church, not the. But if you're somebody whose family has gone to this church for 300 years, and there's mama and there's grandpa buried over there, and the thought that somebody else will take it over is so abhorrent to you, I'm not going to judge you for that, but I still think.
In South Carolina, the leadership, I think, had a lot to do with it, because the leader that was sent in, the bishop that was sent in to address all of these parishes while they were in the process of discerning what they wanted to do, was very, very political, very angry, and he had his agenda, he drove it in, and I believe that caused a lot of division.
So, we're lucky here in Hooterville. We're lucky we don't have these issues. But let me. It's funny how Charlton Heston is told, "Take your shoes off of holy ground." We're talking about Hooterville at the same time. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God, of course, is the God of all people, not just Moses' ancestors, but God does not introduce himself as the universal creator of heaven and earth, because this designation is not relevant or meaningful to the task at hand. God is revealing himself to Moses to have him take the Israelites out of Egypt. He's being specific here. God is God of everything, of course, but I am your God, God of your ancestors, and I've got a job for your people. He's being specific. He's not being sectarian when he says this. He's being specific to the task. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Moses did not really have to fear seeing God because God's invisible. It's not like God is a dragon or something. However, it's unlikely Moses knew that. Moses might simply have been overwhelmed by the awe-inspiring moment and instinctively covered his face. And the Lord continued, I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt. Again, God says, my people. And I have heeded their outcry because of their taskmasters. Yes, I am mindful of their suffering. I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. What's this milk and honey business? Is it the Dairy Council or something? Milk and honey were considered the chief necessities of human life in the ancient Near East. The Bedouin lived on essentially camel's milk and sheep's milk and the honey that they, in other words, that was the basic foodstuffs. So if you're a teenage girl, I am the God of SpaghettiOs and Cheetos. You know, the basic foodstuffs that life cannot go on without.
And Diet Coke.
And Diet Coke.
Pizza.
The region of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now, this is written by a Jewish scholar, so this may be a little argumentative, but notice that the region, not the land. What is being said here, according to this scholar, is that the Canaanites were residents. They were not land. This was not their land, if you will. This was their region. The first independent, freestanding state was Israel. The second was the Jewish kingdom after the return, and the third is the Jewish state that began in 1948. Now, I'm sure Arabs will take this before the Christian era. That's the politically correct way of saying BC. It's the Jewish way.
Oh.
Instead of saying before Christ, they say before the Christian era, which means the same thing, but okay.
Yeah, okay.
Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. Moreover, I have seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. That's a repetition. Come, therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt? One can only imagine Moses' shock. He's leading a completely normal shepherd's life when out of nowhere God appears to him asked him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses responds with a statement of humility. It is often said that in order to successfully run for president of the United States, a person has to have the fire in the belly. Moses is the opposite. He's not a politician. During the American Revolution, the relatively common phrase was the meekness of Moses, which described the humility many were looking for in their prospective leaders. In his 1776 letter to fellow revolutionary John Adams, later to be the second president, wrote, "The management of so complicated and mighty machine as the United States requires the meekness of Moses, the patience of Job, and the wisdoms of Solomon, added to the valor of Daniel." As an aside, the United States' founding is shot through with a biblical worldview. And this is how people thought and talk and think. That they wanted, George Washington really did fit this bill for the early people because he was a man who was called by the country to lead. He didn't stand up and say, "It's me," but rather he was brought forward. And the Lord, he said, "I will be with you." Moses also knows that he's wanted for murder. So going back to Egypt is not a good thing because the Pharaoh wants to kill him. Nevertheless, he does not object to God's assignment on the grounds that would endanger his life. But God knows fear plays a part in Moses' thinking and reassures him, "I will be with you. Don't worry. And that shall be your sign that it is I who sent you. And when you have freed the people from Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain." So Moses has been given this instruction. After he brings them out of Egypt, back to Sinai, he comes. And Moses said to God, "When I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" This is a particularly difficult area for many people to grasp because English is different from Hebrew. And we're getting to grammar here. And when people hear grammar, their eyes roll and they moan and groan. But let's just follow the argument here. Moses' first objection to God's command was, "Who am I?" In this verse, he raises his second objection. "Who are you?" Moses' question signifies the Israelites have strayed so far from their faith, they probably no longer even know God's name or anything about him. They only know that they have a God. It sounds like America today. Yeah, we've heard about Jesus, but, doesn't he see his shadow after he 3 days later, the 7 weeks of winter or something? I don't know. Having grown up in the Egyptian household, Moses presumably knew the gods he knew were the Egyptian gods and now the Midianite gods. Therefore, Moses might have to put the question in the mouth of the Israelites to cover his own ignorance. On the other hand, Moses might simply be expressing an honest desire to more fully understand God. Rabbi Harold Kushner writes, "It may be hard for the modern reader to understand the point of this question. Moses is not changing the subject and saying to God, 'Excuse me, what's your name? I didn't get it the first time.' In ancient times, a name was more than an identifying label. Your name was your essence, what you were all about your identity rather than just your identification. To ask what is God's name is to ask what is God all about? What does he stand for?" Anybody remember the movie Lawrence of Arabia? Lawrence of Arabia is in the desert, and he is being led to King Faisal, and they stop at a well, and Omar Sharif sort of appears as a dot in the distance and gets closer and closer and closer and closer and closer, and his Arab guide sort of stands up and runs for his rifle, and Omar Sharif shoots him. And finally, Omar Sharif comes, and they have this exchange, and the question that Omar Sharif asks Peter O'Toole is, "What is your name?" And "My name is for my friends." Now, Peter O'Toole is not being particularly gay or tetchy by saying this, but in the Arab world, to know your name is to know who you are, what you are, how you are. Because I am so and so and so, son of this and that. So when you add, it's that sort of, having the name sort of gives a sense of identity and almost control. It identifies and puts you in a spot. So in the movie Lawrence of Arabia, when he refuses to give his name, he's refusing to allow Omar Sharif to slot him into a category. And God said to Moses, and this is in Hebrew, Eya Asher Eya. He continued, thus shall you say to the Israelites, Eya sent me to you. This is one of the great moments of the Torah. Just like Moses, we're all expectantly waiting God's answer. And at this sublime moment, God identifies himself with having a name with 4 possible meanings. Translated into English, Eya Asher Eya could mean, I am what I am. Sounds like Popeye. I am who I am. I will be what I will be. Sounds like Doris Day. Que sera, sera. I will be who I will be. The reason all 4 translations are accurate is Hebrew does not have a word for the present tense, the verb to be. In other words, there is no Hebrew word for I am, is, or are. Therefore, in order to say I am Joseph, one would say I need Joseph, I Joseph. The absence of the present tense is not unique to Hebrew. It's true in Russian. You know, sort of the stage Russian, I Boris. They don't say I am Boris in Russian. I Boris, you know, you Natasha, whatever. Such an abstract name would have made no sense to the theologically primitive Israelites, even though God tells Moses to tell the Israelites, Eya, am, or will be, sent him. That name really is for Moses. In other words, God is not trying to sort of play tricks with the Israelites, giving them grammar lessons. We really need to get you into sort of a modern world grammar, but rather, by giving a verb as a name, Moses is being told that this is a living God. I am who I am who I will be, I am what I will be who I will be. All of those are true about God. So God is not an object, an idol, a chair, a place, a statue. God is a living God around you always, living always within you, that can't be confined by a stone or a statue or a mirror or a window or even a word. This is in essence a less violent way of doing things than Oliver Cromwell was doing 400 years ago. Oliver Cromwell and his soldiers smashed the stained glass windows because God is not contained in this piece of colored glass. And we're going to destroy it so you can see that that's true. Now, Moses is given the same sort of lesson, that God is not contained in the word Allah, or in G. Allah is the generic word for God, small g, in that part of the world. Muslims and Christians both pray to Allah, even though we mean two completely different things, it's still God. Let's see, let's move to this. While the term I am what I am is not used again, the most commonly used name for God in the Torah and the rest of the Hebrew Bible is essentially the verb to be. It is composed of the Hebrew letters YHVH, from which we get the word Jehovah or Yahweh. So when we hear Yahweh or Jehovah, that's essentially like the FBI. It's just 3 initials that mean something beyond Yahweh or Jehovah. It means the great I am. And Jehovah is translated as Lord. Adonai is translated as Lord. There are other words that are sort of like small g God. Adonai. Mary, help me with this. Elohim. Elohim. There are other sort of descriptive words that, you know, the Lord, God, mighty, so and so and so forth.
Jews
But
don't pronounce the name of God.
yes,
They have, what was that, hey, yo, yeah, the Yahweh thing. They do that because they feel God's name is too sacred to be pronounced. So they'll use Elohim, Adonai, to describe this God that they can't pronounce his name. But one of the things that's interesting to me is this Hineni was used throughout the Old Testament with Samuel, with Isaac, with Abraham, with Moses, and Jesus said it on the cross. Hineni, here I am.
let me, because we're running out of time, and God said to Moses, thus shall you speak to the Israelites, the Lord, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever. This is my appellation for all eternity. Appellation is another word for name. And go and assemble the elders and say to them, the Lord Yahweh, the God Elohe of your fathers, has appeared to me and said, I have taken note of you and of what has been done in Egypt, and I have declared, I will take you out of the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will listen to you, and they shall go with the elders of Israel to the king of Egypt, and you shall say to them, the Lord Adonai, the God Elohim of the Hebrews, manifested himself to us. God tells Moses to refer to him as the God of the Hebrews because this was a term Pharaoh would understand. In the ancient world, gods were only gods of clans and people. There was no concept of a single God for all of mankind. This was a revolutionary idea that Torah introduced to humanity. The first understanding of a single God for all the world comes in the Old Testament. God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he's also the God of you and me, who are not of the Jewish ancestry. Before this, there was the gods, each nation had a god. When the Elijah and the priests of Baal, they had their, it was like a football game. They had their God versus the other team's God, and we'll see who the greater God is. And the whole point of the Hebrew Old Testament is that there is one God, and he's God of everybody.
He pronounces himself plural, though. He pronounces Trinity in Elohim, because Elohim, the Yod Mem, on the end of that word denotes plural masculine. So I believe this is where he's saying, I am Trinity. I am one and Trinity.
Now, let's see. And now, therefore, let us go a distance of 3 days into the wilderness. God does not want Moses to ask for freedom yet. Pharaoh would say no. Instead, Moses is told to ask Pharaoh to permit the Israelites a week-long sabbatical, 3 days out, time for sacrifice, and 3 days back. The Hebrew word na, which appears in the Hebrew text, which means please, is not translated here. God is actually instructing Moses to be polite in his request of Pharaoh. Now, therefore, please let us go to sacrifice to the Lord our God. Now, Moses' request will be an anathema to Pharaoh for several reasons. It wasn't an affront to the Egyptian religion, in which animals were worshipped as gods. Essentially, Moses will be asking Pharaoh for permission to slaughter Egyptian gods as an offering to the Israelite God. The Torah views animal sacrifice as an appropriate way of serving God. Now let me jump down. Yet I know that the king of Egypt will let you go only because of a great might. God tells Moses Pharaoh will only free the Israelites after Pharaoh is confronted by a formidable show of force. In predicting Pharaoh's behavior, God may be seen to be curtailing Pharaoh's freedom of choice. However, the Jewish and Christian notion of free will allows for divine foreknowledge. As the Rabbi Akiba explains in the Talmud, all is foreseen, yet free will is granted. To put it in contemporary words, God stands outside of time. God is in charge, but he gives us the freedom to choose how we live our lives and how we believe and how we act. But he knows how we're going to do it anyway, because he's not in time, he's outside of time. So I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with various wonders, which I will work upon them. After that, he shall let you go. In the final analysis, all the negotiating is ultimately a charade. Pharaoh will free the Israelites only because of the plagues God will inflict on Egypt. However, God and Moses must first offer Pharaoh the option of freeing the slaves without suffering. God must act justly and therefore cannot inflict the plagues until Pharaoh has made them morally justified. In other words, God is not going to do any preemptive strikes. God is giving them a chance. Now, God, since he's outside of time, knows that they're not going to take this chance, but he still has to do the right thing. And I will dispose the Egyptians favorably toward this people, so that when you go, you will not go away empty-handed. Each woman shall borrow from her neighbor in the lodger in her house objects of silver and gold and clothing, and you shall put these on your sons and daughters, thus stripping the Egyptians. Now the word translated here as shall borrow literally means ask, and can also be translated as request. God does not say that the women shall make demands, even though they are surely entitled to these valuables after hundreds of years of slavery. The women must behave with decency even towards their oppressors. Victims must behave ethically. And that surely is one of the great Torah lessons relevant to the time in which we live. In other words, the Hebrews are due reparations. They have been enslaved, they have been imprisoned, they have had all these horrible things done to them, and they're just, and God is saying, you will be given some things to help you on your journey. Gold, silver, clothing. But you can't take it. You have to ask for it. Just because bad was done to you doesn't give you the right to do bad in return.
It's the old southern thing, smile and say please.
Yes, but here's the thing. In other words, I think this is an important thing to say, to make clear. God is not saying that the Jews have a right to this stuff without asking. They've got to ask. And they have to ask in decency and good order. It is time for the matinee. So I've got to say thank you very much.
Thank you.